Good afternoon. My name is Delsenia Glover, Deputy Public Advocate for Housing Equity, and welcome to the New York City Public Advocate Jumaane D. Williams' second annual State of the People session on housing and justice in New York City. We're going to be talking from redlining to gentrification to homelessness. We are passionate and committed here at the Office of the Public Advocate about the need to redefine our strategy for equity in housing and ending homelessness, which are not separate issues. Our moderator this afternoon is Sia Weaver. She is coordinator of the Housing Justice for All campaign, of which I'm a former member, or still am a member, a coalition of more than 70 organizations whose mission and legislative focus is based on the premise that everyone should have a home who needs one, and she will review the agenda and introduce our presenters. Sia?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Public Advocate Jumaane Williams for his leadership, and to Delsenia for your friendship and your leadership in New York City to end housing insecurity in New York. So I'm really happy to be here. We've got a really exciting panel before us. So our first presentation today is going to be from April DeSimone and Braden Cooks. They are co-creators of Designing the We, Undesign the Red Line, a history of structural racism that has led redlining and draws a line from then to now. April has more than 15 years of experience in strategic designing, developing, and launching for-profit, nonprofit, and government projects. A Dean Merit Scholar, she recently completed her Master of Science in Design and Urban Ecologies from Parsons, the New School of Design. Braden is on the board of the New York State Sustainable Business Council and has served as the president of the board of Sure We Can, a nonprofit collective for canners, who are those who make their living by redeeming cans and bottles for 5 cents. He has an MS in Design and Urban Ecologies from Parsons, the New School for Design, and has taught ecological thinking and urban issues. Immediately following the presentation from Undesign the Red Line, we will hear from Shams DeBaron, aka the Homeless Hero, an activist who has experienced housing insecurity and has led the charge on the Upper West Side's Lucerne Hotel to keep the men located there during the pandemic. Most recently, Shams helped to organize a successful mayoral forum with moderators who were exclusively New Yorkers impacted by homelessness. After the presentations from these exciting panelists, we will open for questions from our viewers across the mediums. If you have questions, please put them in the chat as they come up, and your questions will be fielded to the panelists after the presentations. So if the question occurs, put it in the chat right then before you lose it. Don't wait for the moment later. And we will still get the question and we'll still be able to ask it. Panelists will also be available at the networking event at 5 p.m. immediately following this panel, so we will see you there as well. So I am going to now kick it to Braden and April and talk to you soon.
Thank you for such a wonderful introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure that we're here along with the Public Advocate's Office to really speak about a critical moment that we're in our nation's history. Given the history of what rapidly is happening, whether you call it gentrification or containment and clearance, particularly for communities of color who are on the front line, we launched this exhibition to create contextualization that the moment we're in is a deep, systemic, and entangled history that has brought us to the point where we now have seen the collateral consequences day in and day out play out in our built environment. We launched the Undesign the Red Line exhibition in 2015 on the heels of the Mike Brown and Trayvon Martin murders in this country as a manifesto in action. Because what we have found in our profession as design practitioners, and particularly in the policy space, when we sit at the table to discuss matters, people are in this present moment. And again, don't understand the deeper history, AKA the bigger work that's going to need to take place in order to really advocate the just and inclusive built environments that we long to cultivate and have people part of. If we all believe in democracy, then this is where we start, for the people, by the people, and of the people. Thank you so much, and I'm going to turn it over to Braden.
Thank you, April. Really a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much to the Public Advocate Office for inviting us to do this. I'm going to share my screen here with the exhibit and start us off there. So bear with me as I do that. Okay, so I'm hoping everyone can see this. Um, on Design the Red Line, as April said, is this exhibit which launched in the Bronx and has toured the country as well as many neighborhoods in New York City. And we're going to give you a brief walkthrough today of some parts of that exhibit and talk about its significance for New York today. Here you have in the center of this image uh, a a redlining map. This map is of the Bronx. We always start with the Bronx because we launched in the Bronx. And if you zoom in here, you can see some of the zones that they start creating with these maps. And the maps are issued as part of the New Deal. So the federal government, right? You take yourself back to the 1930s, and the federal government's issuing the New Deal. They're coming out with social safety net programs. They're building the middle class. But okay, it's the 1930s, and the federal government is really explicitly racist, explicitly a white supremacist orientation, and they really want all those programs and policies that are supposed to benefit everybody only to benefit white families. And redlining maps are really one of the ways they do this. So they're part of many policies, and they fit in, to a lot of things that are going on at the time. But the federal government starts to get involved in mortgages, home mortgages. There's also foreclosure crisis during the Great Depression, and they say, you know what, we need to start, insuring home mortgages. They give out the 30-year and 15-year mortgages. Really, some of the programs that are going to make owning your own home a core piece of middle class identity. But okay, they want this to be really reserved for white families. And the way they do that is with these maps, and the maps, are essentially a risk assessment system. They're saying, where should we give out the loans? Where is, we're going to make our money back, and where is too risky? Where are bad places to give out loans to? And this is before you and I would have a credit score. Okay, so this is before that system existed. And instead, they're going to give basically everybody's neighborhood a credit score, right? So you're either, and there's only 4 levels, and you see them here. If you're familiar with this is a silver of the north part of the Bronx. So you get Riverdale there in green, and Fieldston, and then blue, and that's great. That's definitely lend here, right? Then blue, which is second best, yellow, which is sometimes called declining, and then finally red, which are these hazardous areas. And if we zoom down here to South Bronx, right, you start to see huge swaths of red areas. And really, this is going to transform the landscape of many, many communities around the country. One, because this is going to deem those areas, too risky for credit. So this is, it starts with home loans, but this is going into business loans, bank branch locations, the financial system in general, right, is going to get cut off. And so now, it's harder to buy and sell a home, and the property values decline. It's hard to get a loan for a business, and so businesses shutter. And the economy declines in these neighborhoods. And you have to imagine, first of all, when these neighborhoods are redlined, they're hardly, blighted, abandoned, empty places where we might think of as risky. No, these are full neighborhoods that were thriving, neighborhoods where there were storefronts on every corner and, neighbors on the street. These were not anything that we would think of hazardous, which is what they refer to these areas as. But the question is then, why do this to that neighborhood, right? Why slate it for decline in such a way that you can predict, right, that what decades to follow, these neighborhoods went into a cycle of decline and disinvestment? And the answer is in the map. So it's a little hard to see in this image, but there's numbers that correspond here, D5, C9, C7. Each geography has its own corresponding area description. And the area description is really the smoking gun, because it's going to tell us, well, where, why is it yellow, or why is it red, or why is it green, right? We have an area description here for the Bronx, and you get down there to line C. This is very typical language from across the country. Get there, line C, it says detrimental influences, Negro infiltration, right? So we're totally explicit. The federal government, comes out and says, there are hazardous racial and social groups in America, and we need to find out, where they are and where they're quote unquote infiltrating or invading. This is particularly targeted towards Black folks, but also includes, right, Hispanic families, Asian families, groups they call new immigrant or foreign born, which included, Italian immigrants, Eastern European, Jewish people, etc., who at this point in time in American history aren't quite white, right? And they're, so we established, right, this racial hierarchy with Black folks on the bottom and a hierarchy in between there of who has human value, right? And you zoom in here on line C, you see foreign-born families, Italian, and infiltration of Italian and Negro there on line E. And even on line D, you zoom over here, we have a particular thing to call out the percentage of quote-unquote Negro infiltration, right? Which in this case is 3%, right? So it's almost a one-drop rule in a sense, but for a whole neighborhood. And this is going to be a big shift because, beforehand, if I was a Black family, I might have trouble getting a home loan and things like this, and there's discrimination in that sense. But now, so will all my white neighbors because I happen to live on the block. And the idea of things like white flight, as white folks flee these neighborhoods to flee declining property values, hyper segregation. Segregation is increasing before this system rolls out. But then this really doubles down on that and increases hyper segregation in America until at least the 70s and 80s. And really, it hasn't changed much since then. Right. So that 3% becomes 97%. And we began concentrating people into redline neighborhoods at the same time that we're disinvesting and devaluing those neighborhoods, right? So that concentration and that disinvestment are tied together. And then on the other hand, right, we're opening up this huge spigot of investment, which is going to be for home loans and home ownership. Well, who gets that? Well, okay, that goes to these green areas. But what makes an area green is not just to say, yeah, this is where white folks are living. It's also to say, here are areas with restrictions on hazardous infiltration, right? So here are areas where there's a racial covenant that says this is a whites-only neighborhood, or it's in the deed of the house to say you can't sell this house to a Black family or an Asian family, et cetera, et cetera. And the federal government says, that's good. That's what we want to see. Because by preserving racial homogeneity, you preserve property values. And although there's no evidence at that time that that's true, that property values had anything to do with it, as if that would matter, this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where race and real estate value get inextricably linked through this system. And then the second thing that's going to go on is a lot of the places, cities in general are going to get 60 to 80% red and yellow. The areas that are going to get green are often going to be new development, right? Suburban areas that can wall themselves off and say, we're going to be a whites-only neighborhood. And this becomes the places where, suburban development takes hold, and it helps produce, you fast forward till today, right? This helps produce this structural geography that we're used to across the whole country, which is concentrated areas of poverty, mostly people of color in cities, and then much wealthier, much whiter suburbs that surround them. And that basic geography really gets invented through redlining and the systems that are connected to it. And it means that, this is why we think redlining is so important to understand, because it takes us from this explicit Jim Crow era racism where it's written in black and white and designs that into structural racism, where it's literally designed into the physical structure of the whole country, the built environment. And then the second major structural impact is going to be on the racial wealth gap, right? Because not only, as home ownership and property ownership historically, right, the main wealth building system for the past several decades, right? Right, people are going to be systemically cut out of that, and then those that were able to buy homes but bought them in redline neighborhoods are going to see their housing value decline. And this not only it didn't just perpetuate a racial wealth gap, it deepened it and extended it and destroyed wealth for many, many families. And so you fast forward to today, right, and you have this wealth gap, and you have hypersegregation, and you can have, right, different policing, different schools, different hospitals, right, different systems for different people, not need to mention race, but use zip codes and still have, right, an apartheid type system in America. And this is why redlining, this geographic system, becomes so critical to understand what why we still live with the legacies of these racist policies, and that we've never really undone those. So here, just briefly, I want to look before we get to the timeline, where we'll start to really dive into the length of the history. Right here, you see the New York City general region. You can definitely check out these maps. There's a site, a mapping inequality. If you Google that, you can check those out from the University of Richmond. I recommend that. We talk here about the underwriting manual, which is the FHA, which goes everywhere. So even if your place didn't have a map, it'll use that. It uses the same language of infiltration and invasion. And I also want to show you something from um, uh, a real estate textbook. So this is from the private real estate industry. And this predates redlining, right? So these are the ideas that get filtered up into government policy, but it starts in this is from private real estate. It says, the colored people certainly have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but they must recognize the economic disturbance which their presence in a white neighborhood causes and forego their desire to split off from the established district where the rest of their race lives. Right? They refer to that as the property value argument, because if you're a good realtor, you protect the property value of your clients, right? And this is how. And, obviously by the 1968 Fair Housing Act, you won't find this type of language, although the mentality is still very much so alive and well, as you may imagine. And this is going to be the way we set up inequity in so many of our systems that we have today. So that takes us to the timeline. I'm going to pass it over to April, and we're going to walk through this very quickly, but you can spend more time at it on our website too.
So we launched this timeline to take a look at what preceded redlining. As Braden mentioned, the mental models were very much intact from the first boats landing on this continent. Redlining is not a practice that begins with the maps that you're seeing. It begins first even with the First Nations people, with marking red lines around their reservations and placing them in clearance and containment and violent appropriation of land. One of the main takeaways of Section 1 that really sets us up is what we explored was the eugenics and the scientific racism movement. And when you have people who are buying into a system of dehumanization, which is what this equates to, it really sets the tone that those who are put in positions of authority to steward the ideologies and, again, principles of democracy are making decisions based on supremacy and making decisions based on the hierarchy of human value. So when you have people like Madison Grant creating the pathway and mentoring Teddy Roosevelt, and the young Homer Hoyt, who comes out of the University of Chicago and sets into motion the 100 years of land value language, basically setting up and makes ethnicities detrimental and ties them to property value. We know that these are deep and systemic issues within our built environment. And when Homer Hoyt becomes the chief economist of the Federal Housing Administration, coming from this school of thought and writing in his dissertation that Negro infiltration, Mexican infiltration are hazardous impacts to land value, we begin to understand the institutionalized racism that really sets the tone again for the housing crises, for the vast inequities in wealth and education and in health that we're experiencing today. And the top of the timeline represents these macro systems. The bottom that you're seeing in front of you is the truth to power, the pushbacks from a grassroots perspective that really is trying to undo these integrated, entangled systems. One of the notable pieces here is that after the Civil War, and we fight this battle to really, again, set the tone and usher in Reconstruction, we had the passing of the Civil Rights Acts that guaranteed human rights. And we didn't need civil rights movements if we just adhere to what was already incorporated here. And it goes to show you that even with the best intentions of policy, when it trickles down and has to exist within the ecosystem of these complexities, what we will get is, again, what comes after this era, New Deal type policies that codify what was already existing, as I said, since the first boats landed on this continent. Era two leads us up into now these redlining policies and the intercorrelation with not just redlining, not just that the New Deal was created to save banks and save insurance companies because they were just too big to fail. This is a rebranding of, again, the 2008 housing crises. But we know that this leads to a myriad of other issues, particularly with the propaganda of ascribing race and identity as pariah, as something that is we need to flee from. And we see all sorts of practices, from white flight to blockbusting, to slum clearance, to contract buying. But then we also see on the wave of this, the ushering in of urban renewal policies that were subsequently put into place during the New Deal era or shortly thereafter. And we see things like the Cross Bronx Expressway or other interstate highway systems plowing through historic Black communities. And if you ask what urban renewal was, you will hear that it's also known as Negro removal. And it shows and demonstrates, again, this mental model of a power dynamic that is unleashing sort of the carnage into the built environment. And again, we have these pushbacks. I highly recommend many of you, if you haven't had an opportunity, to read the Separate but an Unequal book, because it becomes really important to see sort of what's separate and unequal in the Tale of Two Cities, particularly during the uprisings in this country. And even though we're making this concerted effort, we still are where we're at today with these tremendous divides.
So as April, so as April was getting into here, we have these waves of policy that come into redline neighborhoods, right? So first of all, you have, all of this that precedes redlining. Then you have the codification of that through the New Deal. Then you have urban renewal, and that leads to new waves of displacement, right? New waves of disinvestment. And whether that's the building of highways or stadiums or public housing, right, which at first, when public housing is built, thought of as a big step up. It's often segregated just for white families, but then that gets defunded by the federal government, right? And public housing enters into a crisis. And then so do many, many neighborhoods in our cities. And you have an era which they referred to at the time as urban decay. So you see that over there on the left side there, right? And neighborhoods across the country began in a real spiral of disinvestment. And you have capital flight. So, folks pulling money out of businesses and real estate, the shuttering of factories and blue collar jobs leaving cities, the tax base leaving, and cities in general start hemorrhaging cash. And in New York City, one of the answers to that is a program called planned shrinkage. And in planned shrinkage, we're going to say, well, you know what? We don't have enough money anymore, right, for the whole city. So what we need to do is identify neighborhoods that are quote unquote dying, read redline neighborhoods, and neighborhoods that are quote unquote healthy, read neighborhoods that didn't get redlined. And we're going to cut off and sacrifice our our dying neighborhoods and save money for our healthy ones, right? And we see again that mental model of where is dying, who is dying, what is healthy, what does that mean? And so then in these neighborhoods, Brownsville, Brooklyn to Bushwick to the South Bronx, we have the cutting off of street maintenance, trash pickup, schools, libraries, parks. The very first thing to get cut was actually fire departments. Believe it or not, it's the very first smart cities program where they had an algorithm, and all those neighborhoods, right, are going to burn. And so now we have epidemics arise out of this. Epidemic blight and abandonment, epidemic fires, the heroin epidemic, right, talked about in the 1970s as a criminal crisis, right? Well, now we're in the opioid epidemic, right, talked about as a public health crisis. Well, not so, right, back then when it's affecting a different group of people. This is followed by the HIV/AIDS epidemic, the crack epidemic, right? And you have the just constant damage and collateral damage of communities getting broken up, displacement, homelessness, eviction, moving around of families. And then from the bottom up, right, you have a big pushback. You have the uprisings, And you have a community action movement that arises in that era, right? Where you see community organizing, which really got started with the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, who do street cleanup days to clean up trash the city won't clean up, and school lunches. And then, Community Reinvestment Act, community development corporations, community gardens, right? So this pushback to say, look, we're in a crisis, and the answer is let's rebuild our communities. But a totally different response from the top down, right? Where you'll see, calls from all over there, right? But the need is to crack down. And by cracking down, right, we're going to bring the city back to normal. And so starting with Nixon and the war on drugs into the Reagan era and the Clinton era, right, we have programs like Broken Windows, right, which is to say, well, by cracking down on criminals and vandals and drug dealers, we'll bring the city back to normal, and that will be the answer, right? But of course, our question is, well, why are the windows broken? Well, we're not going to say, oh, it's broken because of this huge history of structural racism that goes back to redlining and beyond. No, it's these people that are living here, and we need to crack down on them. And so mass incarceration becomes, in many ways, the response. And you have the quote unquote cleaning up of neighborhoods, which paves the way for investment to start pouring back in. And now, right, we have that era where speculative real estate and investment is pouring back into many red line neighborhoods for the first time. But because of this structural history, folks are not benefiting, right, from that investment. They're being pushed out. And we have a new era of housing affordability crisis, homelessness and eviction and gentrification. And we have a new era of pushing back. And that's what we're a part of today. And I know we're running short on time, but I'm going to just hit here. There's a few key lessons to take out of this whole history that we really have to keep in mind when we're now designing new systems and new policies. And when we work with folks to do that, we always keep this in mind, which is that, one, throughout this history, right, no one is, when they're creating these policies and programs, right, they're not challenging their perceptions. They're not telling this history. Nobody's looking at this timeline to ask, how did we actually get here? They're coming up with their own stories and then implementing policy based on that. Two, right, the process of design and the decision-making is not fully democratized, right? The folks who are closest to these crises are hardly ever, if ever, really at the table in a creative way to say, how can we move forward? And then three, right, the policies, practices, and investments therefore end up recreating and reinforcing the existing dynamics rather than undoing and repairing them. And we always say, there's no neutral on a moving train, right? If it's not undoing this history, it is almost certainly reproducing it. And these are the things that we need to keep in mind. So thank you. We'll leave it there. You can definitely check us out and see more about the exhibit on our website. And thank you so much to the public advocate, Jimani Williams, for inviting us here. We are so excited to be able to give this presentation as part of today.
And thank you to Delsenia as well for convening this amazing group. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much. The exhibit is really beautiful. I've seen it several times and feel like I learn something new every time. And in that same spirit, that those closest to the problems are closest to the solutions as well, I'm really excited to turn it over to Shams DeBaron, aka the Homeless Hero, who's going to talk a little bit about the fight against homelessness in our city. Thank you.
You're muted, Shams. You're muted.
Greetings, everybody. I'm honored to be here among you all. I would like to thank Public Advocate Jimani D. Williams and the Housing Equity team for asking me to be here today. It is a true privilege. It is a monumental moment for me to be given this seat at the table and voice in the discussion that centers around the issue of housing equity. A year ago from this day, my life was much different. None of you knew me. I was just a CARES number, the number given to you when you enter the shelter system, the same way they give you a number when you enter a jail. At that time, while in the shelter, I was in the beginning stages of my recovery for my struggle with alcohol, and as well as seeing a psychiatrist for my struggle with mental illness. It was a rough period for me because I was still contemplating suicide. The drama of me being a descendant of 400 plus years of slavery, systemic racial oppression, depression, and suppression had taken its toll on me. One second. One second. The trauma of growing up after being born into the world by parents who were heroin addicts that lost custody of me into the foster care system at the age of 2, then being 10 years old and homeless in the streets, walking the streets in the cold darkness of the night, or riding the trains as a child with no place to go, having to protect myself from the perverts and predators, all has taken its toll. I experienced the trauma of watching my childhood friend become front page news after a shootout with 30 New York City cops escaping unharmed and leading the country on one of the biggest manhunts in history has taken its toll on me. Yet, the difference between last year and today is that after being a victim of COVID-19 and almost dying, when I regained my strength and got a new lease on life and decided to devote every moment of my time to creating a world that I wanted to live in, I vowed not to waste a moment being bitter and complaining, but to go out and be the change that I wanted to see. So I evolved into the homeless hero to address the issues of homelessness and challenge the city to do better by those of us experiencing homelessness. And in less than 7 months, I and those with me, like the Upper West Side Open Hearts Initiative and Project Renewal and the public advocate, Jamani D. Williams, and his housing team, have been able to change the narrative about people experiencing homelessness. Media all over the world have covered our story because people want to know, how did we take on such a powerful mayor and win? They're fascinated with this modern day David versus Goliath story. Today, suffice it to say, I ain't contemplating suicide. I'm ready to take on the world in order to eradicate homelessness and restore our people their dignity and respect. In this effort, I will address not just the issue of homelessness, but the root causes of homelessness. My goal is to help us eradicate systemic racism and abolish the structural institutions that support and perpetuate white supremacy. There can be no housing equity or housing justice unless you address the issue of racial and wealth inequality in America. All of the issues you see with us today can be traced back to our history as Black men and women kidnapped from our native lands and brought here to be slaves. They granted us emancipation, but didn't give us reparations. We never got that 40 acres and a mule. So when you look at us today and you see us in a position that you think is uncivilized or not up to your standards, or to use the current mayor's words, not acceptable. There's a reason for that, a systemic reason for that. Here we are, after a failed reconstruction following the Civil War, the victims of the Black Codes, which were put in place after the assassination of President Lincoln, and his successor made sure that Black people would remain in subservient positions here in the United States in perpetuity. They codified the oppression of Black people in America. The laws were designed to keep us down. It was never meant for us to rise up and be equal in society to white people. So Roosevelt's New Deal was not designed to help us. It was designed to help poor whites rise out of the Depression. The war and its aftermath produced opportunities for home ownership and generational wealth that benefited white people only. Black, brown, and other people of color were left out of that. When they built the housing projects, which we call NYCHA today, it wasn't built for us. It was built for poor and middle-class whites as a leg up to buying a home. They were granted loans to purchase homes in suburbs. The banks supported the white flight from the city. We couldn't follow them because we couldn't get those loans, and they wouldn't let us in those communities anyway. With white people gone, there was massive disinvestment in our communities. The disinvestment in our communities, coupled with the influx of drugs, destroyed our people and further hindered our progress. The notion that many of us live in substandard conditions because we are bad is a farce. The fact is that many of us are in poor housing and lacking wealth because of the system of white supremacy that has yet to be dismantled. The Federal Housing Administration of Roosevelt's New Deal was rooted in discrimination, as was the GI Bill of 1944. None of that benefited Black and brown people. Those initiatives were not good for us then, just as this fake Affordable Housing Act and the scam that they call a lottery is not good for us now. Those who can't afford to live in the new, what I call fake affordable housing, since the levels of affordability do not reflect the population of the city, will be headed to one of those shelters that are planned for each borough and be fed into the ecosystem that is the shelter industrial complex. In the 1970s, America declared a war on drugs, which was really a war on Black and brown people. This war led to mass incarceration, further building their prison industrial complex, which helped to change the dynamics of our communities through redlining. The urban planners knew that at some point they would be back to gentrifying our neighborhoods. A president declared that certain distressed communities in our city would be empowerment zones. This opened up the door for big businesses, real estate developers, and banks to come into our communities and benefit themselves, but not us. Gentrification feeds the shelter industrial complex, and it is deliberate. along with the prison industrial complex, it serves the same purpose. And that is to keep Black and brown people down while maintaining the status quo of white supremacy. I will close now. For it to be new, we can't go back to the old way of doing things. We are the people, and for this to work, we, the people, have to design this New Deal. The people, that means you and I, have to be united for the cause of eradicating homelessness from our city. That means moving from shelter first, from a shelter first policy to adopting a policy of housing first. We must start by immediately closing congregate shelters because they are death traps. And then we have to dismantle the shelter industrial complex by building housing for all. People power must be the law of the land. Thank you.
It's hard to follow that. Thank you, Shams, for your leadership on this issue and the work that you're putting in to ensure dignified housing for everyone. We have some time for some questions. The first I'm going to answer. It's from the website. Landlords are taking advantage of the pandemic and evicting people, and what can we do to stop this? So I want to be really clear that right now there's a pause on evictions in New York State. The state legislature passed one of the strongest eviction moratoriums in the country, and you can protect yourself if you have faced hardship because of COVID-19 from evictions. Your landlord cannot evict you. You have to go to www.evictionfreeny.org, and you can fill out a hardship declaration form to protect yourself from eviction. And if you have any questions, you can go to www.housingjusticeforall.org, and I can talk to you one-on-one. And then the second question, also from the website, HPD public-private contracts between nonprofits and for-profit developers are proprietary. When will these contracts become available to all stakeholders? I'll answer that quickly and then open it up to more questions. But just want to name that on October 15th, 2020, the public advocate, Jumaane Williams, introduced legislation, Intro 2121, which would require the Department of Housing Preservation and Development to maintain a certification correction list and prohibit any listed landlords from certifying correction of violations in multiple dwellings without inspection. Within the current system, landlords are able to self-certify their own repairs without city verification, and this would prevent landlords already identified as bad actors from falsely claiming repairs. So in the public advocate's office is working hard to oversight over negligent landlords at HPD. And I want to see if Delsenia has anything to add there before we go into some more questions.
No, I don't have anything to add to that. I just want to, because we have to be out of this room and into the networking room in like 1 minute. So what I want to do is thank everyone very, very much for your participation here today. Sia, thank you. Also, right back at you for your friendship and all the work that you do in housing justice. Braden and April, thank you both so much. You know, I fell in love with this project when I saw it a few years ago down in Washington, D.C. I believe I was at the National Low Income Housing Coalition Conference. And Shams, who I met on 79th Street on the Upper West Side, standing outside the Lucerne Hotel. Thank you very, very much. And I also want to thank Nora, and the other gentleman who I don't have his name in front of me, who helped us with the interpretation. Thank you so much. You do great work. You do God's work. And we are going to close here. And I hope to see all of our viewers, as because all of the folks on the panel and some folks additionally from Tenants and Neighbors and CAMBA and the Racial Impact Study Coalition will be in the networking room that starts at 5 o'clock. So check the website for the link and join us there. Thanks, everybody.